there's no country that interferes in the internal affairs of other countries more than the United States does.
Isn't that the truth? There's John Mearsheimer, who recently went on Judge Andrew Napolitano's podcast, Judging Freedom, to talk about what the recent discussions between Trump and Putin mean for the situation in Ukraine. I think he had a lot of interesting, points in this. So let's watch and let's review and let's react.
Do you see any significance in the so-called agreement between Presidents Trump and Putin and belatedly Zelensky on this so-called ceasefire? We won't attack energy infrastructure, even though each of them has done so. Do you see, I'm being a little snarky, do you see any significance in that?
No, it's largely irrelevant. It's just subject matter that gives us something to talk about on shows like this. This doesn't matter. What matters is whether or not Trump and Putin can reach an agreement on the three key demands that the Russians have made to settle this conflict once and for all. The Russians have made it unequivocally clear there's going to be no meaningful ceasefire until there is agreement on their three demands and until you have in place a meaningful peace agreement. And as far as I can tell, we're nowhere near a meaningful peace agreement. And what we're talking about is a ceasefire. And again, the Russians say no ceasefire of any consequence until you get a meaningful agreement.
Do you think that Putin said this is pure speculation, to Trump, turn off the spigot of aid and intel and then we'll talk?
I don't know what they talked about. For me, the really key issue is not that question that you just raised. The key issue for me is what they said about the key Russian demands.
Right.
Again, to settle this war, the Americans, the Ukrainians, and the Europeans have to agree to what I think are the three key demands of the Russians. And if you don't accept those demands, it goes on and on and on.
It's just been the truth. I mean, ever since the 90s, ever since, the memo came out, the Nyet means Nyet memo by William Burns, former CIA director under Biden, who at that point was the Ukrainian ambassador, said that Ukraine's inclusion in NATO was a red line. And if that's not on the table, that they have to preclude that and prohibit it, I don't think any peace will come, and especially as long as the U.S. continues funneling in aid and military intelligence to Ukraine.
They can't even agree on what they talked about because the Kremlin readout was different from the White House readout. Now, here's Carolyn Levitt being grilled by a reporter. It may be a Russian reporter, I'm not sure, but in the White House press room. About the difference between the two readouts. Chris, cut number 2.
Kremlin readout mentioned that Trump and Putin spoke about potential U.S.-Russia hockey games, and the Kremlin readout also said that Russia wanted the U.S. to stop U.S. intelligence and U.S. funding to Ukraine. The president has said that conversation did not happen. Just wondering if you can get us any more clarity on that, and also, again, if it's energy infrastructure or if it's energy and infrastructure, because I think there is a big difference between that.
Again, as for the readouts of the call, I would defer you to ours. And when it comes to the topic of hockey, it did come up. However, we're more interested in securing a peace deal than scheduling hockey games right now. Sean.
So, shocker, she didn't even answer the real meat and potatoes of that question, whether or not that was discussed, whether or not Moscow and Putin and his ambassadors had directly asked the U.S. to turn the spigot off. Look, Trump is not going to admit that if that happened, and it's likely it probably did. It seems like the most basic ask you could ever want or have if you're Russia. It's the most obvious ask in the world, is to stop being a belligerent in this war, and we can talk peace. But he's not going to admit that, Trump isn't, because he campaigned on ending U.S. involvement in Ukraine, more or less. And if it gets out that that was asked and his response was to be like, no, we got to continue funding Ukraine. I just recently restored military and intelligence aid to Ukraine. it just makes him look terrible in terms of his campaign promises. And trust me, politicians overtly abandon their campaign promises all the time, but this is one of the big ones that he had. This isn't the same as when he mocked Biden for bombing Yemen and then he does it. This was a major focal point of the 2024 presidential campaign.
So who knows what they talked about? They certainly didn't talk about a ceasefire on the energy infrastructure for 2.5 hours. I mean, they must have talked about bigger pictures. You think they talked about realism and reset?
I would bet that they talked about the Russian demands, and they're just not going public. I find it hard to believe that they talked for 2+ hours and didn't get to the heart of the issue. I mean, Trump has a deep-seated interest in settling this sooner rather than later.
Right.
In fact, I think he wants to secure a peace for the accomplishment that brings for his legacy and his ego, more than ending U.S. involvement. I think that's why he's so interested in discussing the end of this war with Putin, whereas Biden wasn't. But really, from an America First perspective, the best thing would just be to withdraw U.S. troops, and that can be your endgame. I think a peace with Russia and Ukraine would follow that, but that's what we really want. That's the true America First argument.
Right.
You would think he would therefore bring up, and you would think Putin would bring up the key issues that have to be addressed.
Do you see any connection between these two disparate sets of behavior on Trump's part? One doing what he can to bring about peace, short of turning off the spigot of arms, to bring about peace in Ukraine, and two, giving Netanyahu whatever he wants to slaughter innocents in Gaza. You see any connection there?
No, there's no connection. As I said, I think the difference is the Israel lobby has huge influence in the Middle East. If you took the Israel lobby out of the American political system, let's assume there's no Israel lobby, the United States would have had for many years now, decades now, a fundamentally different policy toward Israel. It is very important to understand, hardly anyone will say this, but U.S. policy toward Israel is not in the American national interest. Israel is an albatross around our neck, but no president can challenge Israel in any meaningful way because of fear of the Israel lobby. And this includes Donald Trump. So you take away the Israel lobby, and I would bet my life savings that Donald Trump would have a fundamentally different policy towards the Middle East, and it would look a lot like his policy toward Ukraine. But the fact is, Donald Trump's views and his policies on the Middle East are heavily influenced by Miriam Adelson and people of that sort.
Okay.
Impossible to deny. I mean, all of the foreign policy debacles in the Middle East mostly are a result of our entangling alliance with Israel. Netanyahu wanted the United States to overthrow Saddam Hussein in Iraq. He's wanted the U.S. to overthrow the Ayatollahs in Iran. He wanted the U.S. to side with ISIS against Assad in Syria. And now he wants us to bomb the Houthis. And initially, the U.S. got involved in the theater of Yemen as part of a Saudi-backed resistance against one faction within Yemen during the Yemeni civil war, and it still is ostensibly for that purpose. But the Houthis want to support the Palestinians. They've kind of stuck their neck out to do that. So Israel now wants us to rattle sabers with them. And it's just, domino after domino gets us into these stupid alliances and alliance structures that are so counterintuitive to average Americans.
Let's transition to Europe. Is there any evidence from any source of which you are aware that Vladimir Putin plans to invade Western Europe?
No, it's not even a serious argument.
Maybe do you think that Starmer and Macron and Merz and Maloney go to bed at night worrying and wondering if this is going to happen?
I'm tempted to say no because they're supposed to be serious people, but just listening to them talk, I'm not sure they're serious people. I mean, when I listen to Starmer and Macron talk about this coalition of the willing and what it's going to do in Ukraine and so forth and so on, I tend to think they're delusional. And so I find it hard to believe myself, just using my own critical faculties, that they think that Russia's going to invade countries in Eastern Europe, much less be a military threat to Western Europe. But they talk about that all the time. So maybe they are delusional.
It sure seems delusional to me, and I think all that is, the chest beating, the coalition of the willing talk. It's reminiscent of the Iraq War in 2003. But truthfully, they're not going to devote troops to the Eastern Front against Russia, and Putin's not going to invade Poland. It's just so absurd. That draws a NATO conflict because of Article 5 automatically. It makes no sense, and it would be totally, again, counterintuitive to the Russian interest, even if he had, conquest ambitions in Eastern Europe. Like Mearsheimer says, it's not even a serious argument. It's been said, throughout the U.S. media that is. I mean, people have said, Putin's trying to reconstitute the USSR and, acquire mass territory, but it's never really borne out. He clearly wanted the Russian culturally influenced part of Ukraine and Crimea. And it's not even clear that he ever wanted Kyiv and the central part of Ukraine's government.
Is the United States abandoning Europe?
Well, I think there's no question that Trump intends to greatly reduce the American commitment to Europe. I think he does not like the Europeans. He's contemptuous when it comes to the Europeans. He does not like NATO. He wants to have good relations with Putin and with Russia more generally. And I think slowly but steadily, we are moving away from Europe. Now, whether we fully pull out remains to be seen. I would note to you, Judge, that if you listen to the Europeans talk, if you listen carefully, I think most of the European leaders understand that that is in the offing. They understand that Trump wants out and that relations between the two sides of the Atlantic are not good and not likely to improve, and indeed, if anything, get worse. So I would be very surprised if NATO is a meaningful institution by the time Trump leaves office.
So two observations from my interview last week with Sergei Lavrov. One, I asked him if or when the United States leaves NATO, what will become of it? And he rejected my premise. He doesn't think the United States will leave NATO. And two, was off the record and not being taped. I said, are you guys really going to, this is at the time that Marco Rubio said he had an agreement with Zelensky for a ceasefire. I said, are you really seriously considering a ceasefire? And he said, why would we? We are, and then he stopped, meaning that close, holding his forefinger and thumb about 1.5 inches apart to indicate very close to achieving our objective. So to the first statement, rejecting my premise that the United States will leave NATO. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think he's probably right that the United States is not going to leave NATO in a formal sense. But as I was saying before, I think that we're going to greatly reduce our commitment to NATO. And we are going to great lengths. We will go to great lengths to turn NATO over to the Europeans. Let them run NATO. I wouldn't be surprised, for example, if the SACEUR, the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, who has traditionally been an American, is at some point in the not too distant future a European general or admiral. So I think the United States is going to have much less influence in NATO, and I think it'll probably be, as an institution, it'll probably be a hollow shell by the end of Trump's term.
I sure hope so, because compared to the status quo, that'd be fantastic. There's been no more dangerous entangling alliance than ours with Israel and ours with NATO in the last century. So I would love Trump to resurrect his campaign idea in his first term where he talked about just ejecting the U.S. from NATO. That would be ideal from a non-interventionist standpoint. But if we can reduce the U.S. involvement in it, kind of, the banner waver, the primary player, and as Mearsheimer said, hand it over to the Europeans, that would be a huge, huge advancement compared to the status quo. It wouldn't be ideal for me. I'm not for entangling alliances at all. I'm with Jefferson. Peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations. Entangling alliances with none. That's my mantra. And that's really the original American creed that we should be following, at least according to me.
If you define realism as a universal respect for the sovereignty, the borders, and the legitimate security needs of other countries, hasn't NATO collectively rejected realism? And am I not talking to, at this very moment, the principal progenitor of this theory, John Mearsheimer?
Well, there is no question that the United States does not believe in the sovereignty of other countries.
Right.
There's no country that interferes in the internal affairs of other countries more than the United States does. The color revolutions in Eastern Europe, our attempt to do regime change in both Beijing and Moscow are just some examples of our proclivity for violating the sovereignty of other countries. And I would note to you that we recoil when anybody interferes in our sovereignty.
Right.
All this talk about the Russians being involved in the 2016 election, it just drove Americans crazy, even though it wasn't true. Russiagate was a false narrative. But nevertheless, we don't like any other country violating our sovereignty. Yet we go around the world violating the sovereignty of other countries.
One exception, most of the political class has no problems with Israel violating our sovereignty and influencing our politics. I'll say that, but he's right on the money here. No power gets entangled in other governments more than the U.S. We heard all sorts of nonsense about Russian interference in the U.S. when the real foreign influence comes from Ukraine and Israel. That's where it comes from. And the real foreign influence coming domestically goes from the United States to basically all other countries in the world for the sake of empire and hegemony.
And this does not make good sense.
What do you think will become of Europe with a diminished NATO and an absent or diminished U.S.? I mean, is Germany going to rearm and point missiles at Moscow? Is the Starmer going to quintuple the size of his 42,000-man army? Are the French going to saber rattle their nuclear weapons?
Well, there are two issues at play here. One is what the United States does, but the other issue is how serious you think the Russian threat is. If you believe there's a serious Russian threat to Europe, then that gives the countries of Europe an incentive to rearm in a systematic way and to coordinate their efforts to try to contain this Russian threat, even in the absence of the United States. But as you and I were talking about a few minutes ago, there is no serious threat to Europe from Russia. Russia is simply not powerful enough or foolish enough to try to overrun Eastern Europe, much less all of Europe. So the threat is not there, number one. And number two, the Americans are greatly reducing their presence in European affairs, in all likelihood. What this means is that the European countries that form what we call Europe are going to pursue their own interests in ways that lead to clashes among those countries. And you're going to have a significant collective action problem among the countries in Europe. And you're not going to have the Americans there and the Russian threat there to help mitigate these collective action problems. So therefore, in the future, talking about Europe as if it were a single entity is not going to make any sense at all, because what we're going to see at play are different countries pursuing their own interests in ways that often clash with the interests of other European countries.
That would be fantastic as far as I'm concerned. If these European powers and Macron and Starmer and whoever else, the EU, really views Putin and Russia as a threat, let them rearm themselves. Let them take up arms. The U.S. should get the hell out of the way from that, though. Allow them to do whatever they want. They have their own sovereign, security interests at heart. So let them do that. Get the U.S. out of it. There's no sense in subsidizing the military security of other countries. We're done in Europe. We've been done since 1945 in Europe, truly. Maybe you can argue the Cold War, going up to, the breaking down of the Berlin Wall, but Europe wasn't under a serious threat of falling, at least to the west of Germany. So it's just so ridiculous that the U.S. still has to subsidize this on the back of the American taxpayer. Trump's best rhetoric was when he said, let's get out of this business. Let's withdraw from NATO. That's what I'd like to see. I don't think the European chess beating will amount to anything as far as sending troops to Ukraine or any madness like that. But I sure would like to hand NATO or the EU alliance structure over to the Europeans where it should be. The U.S. shouldn't be involved in this. But I want to hear from you guys. What do you guys think about NATO? Do you think it's time for the U.S. to withdraw from NATO immediately? And what do you think about handing over NATO to the European allies if ejection from NATO isn't on the table? Let me know in the comments below. And until next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. I'll see you guys later. Peace out.